Alright guys, top 6 requirements gathering techniques as a business analyst. What are the top 6 that I use the most? Let's get started right away here with the whiteboard. Number 1, what is the first requirements gathering technique I want to show you? It is document-based analysis. So let's write this down quickly here. So what is that? Document-based analysis. So whenever you get onto a new project, there are always documentations of the application. And what I like to do is I like to read these documents first, and based on the documents that you analyze, you can also extract requirements. That's the first technique, how you gather requirements. Another technique very often used is or are interviews. So interviews. So what is an interview? And in your interview you could see that you as a business analyst and a stakeholder, preferably a user or someone who has knowledge about whatever you're trying to build, to interview the person. So you're going into the conversation, usually it's a one-to-one or maybe it's multiple people, but if you have a lot of people in it, then the next technique is the one for you. But in the interview you're asking questions to understand the requirement more. Then the next technique that's building upon interviews is a step further. These are the workshops. So, the workshops. What is a workshop? What is the difference? Well, a workshop usually is with multiple people instead of just one person, for example, in an interview. In a workshop, we really gather a couple of people, maybe per business unit, you have a representative in there, and together you can analyze and gather requirements in a workshop. So you can all together work on it. Usually plan a lot more time into this, like a workshop could be multiple hours, half a day, a full day, or even multiple days in a row, right? So you get really focused on the topic itself, and these are the workshops. So number 3. Number 4, what else do we have of the most used techniques to gather requirements? It could be a survey. So let me enter this here, a survey. So what do I mean with this? So what you could do actually is you could create a survey to ask users or stakeholders about their opinion and gather requirements from the survey, right? So you could ask multiple people at the same time with the survey. It's very not individual, it's super broad, and you're asking questions in a survey to people. That's the 4th one. What else do we have? Then we have prototyping. Prototyping. So what is prototyping? When I say prototyping, what I mean is actually you try to build a very small viable product, an MVP, just to demonstrate stuff, a proof of concept, so to speak. So building a very rudimentary first increment or version of something to then gather new requirements upon this, right? So if you build something, you bring it in front of a user, the user sees it, uses it, and instantly you get new requirements, right? So you can gather new requirements. That's this technique. And the last technique I want to talk about today is called shadowing. So, shadowing. So what is shadowing? Shadowing basically means that you try to shadow your user, so you are the shadow of the user. So whenever the user is using your application, you just watch them, you observe them, how they use the system, which pitfalls they fall into, which thought process they have. So just by observing them, you get new requirements because you can see the user is always doing certain things, and you could maybe do it better and making it quicker for the user instead of how initially thought. So these are the 6 the most used requirements gathering techniques for me as a business analyst. And let me also tell you what is the pro and the con of each, and also when do I use what exactly. So I've started with the document-based analysis, and this is basically something I do in the beginning to get into the topic first. Gather the documents, analyze the documents, understand the application, understand what's going on already. That's the very first step to really get my foot into it. That's it. That's how I would use the document-based analysis. Then I mentioned the interviews. When would I use an interview? It's basically mostly I use an interview if I want to talk about, let's say there's a stakeholder using my application and they need a certain feature, so I go into an interview with that person to understand which problem does this person have, what's the need, and which problem does the user try to solve, asking why they want to do it like this, right? That's an interview with one person usually. That's something I use, I think, the most actually, like interviewing people. Super important, super critical. Then I have the workshops. So what I like to do is, if I have multiple interviews with different stakeholders across different departments, I like to organize a workshop to get all the people necessary together in one room. This could be the compliance department, then I have my IT developers, maybe I have some people from the business for sure, and maybe there's another unit too that needs to be involved from the operations team, right? So with the workshop, you have to be very careful because it's very time consuming and it costs a lot of money for your organization. Like if there are 10 people or 20 people, whatever. So this is very tricky, right? Workshops is something you should not just do a lot in the sense of like wasting time, because also you could get a bad reputation in your organization if you have like these boring workshops, you know what I mean? Nothing is coming out, no outcome. So a workshop has to be really used with caution and very well organized and prepared. But it's a stable go-to for me to do this, especially if I have to gather multiple different units into one room so they can talk to each other. All right, the survey, probably the one I use the least to gather requirements. The survey is very, how can I say, not very personal, right? So you try to make a question on a survey that goes through a lot of people, and then you get standardized answers to the standard questions usually. And it's not my favorite technique to do. What I do like about surveys is maybe probably to measure how satisfied users are with your product. That's totally fine. And but yeah, to gather requirements, I just prefer the other techniques. I didn't use surveys myself that often, to be honest. Next to surveys, I had prototyping. This is something I do frequently. So like prototyping is nothing I do initially as the first step. So I always did something before, like a workshop, an interview, or an analysis first. But then I got an idea about something, and then I dive deeper with a prototype, and then I show this prototype to the stakeholders and gather requirements. This is what I like to do, or I use prototypings. Shadowing, I also like to use this one. So basically I just try to observe a user to really understand what they're doing. And it has been quite useful to me, to be honest, because being from the IT department, for example, you just don't have the perspective of an operations user or of a business person, right? And if you are next to them and you can talk to them all the time, then you have a lot more chances actually to see what the real need is. So that's why and how I would use it. Okay, very quick summary again. What's the pro and con? The workshop. The pro is you can get all units together, which is important. The con is you need a lot of resources and costs a lot of money. Interviews, I think that's a great tool to have, like to get the opinion of one or two persons. But the con is, of course, if you have just talking to one person, the whole picture is kind of like missing. That's the con here, but very useful one. Document analysis, for sure, the con is you get really easy to read some stuff, you get the initial knowledge very quick and easy, but that's the limitation too, because you cannot ask questions, right? There's no person in front of you, it's just a document. Then prototyping, the pro and the cons. Of course, the con is it takes some time to prototype stuff, that's for sure. And maybe people will be like, yeah, it's quite not that useful to do these things. And sometimes we over-engineer things too. So sometimes we don't need a prototype and then we tend to do one, so over-engineering. But the pro is for sure, like you can really try to have a quick experiment on the requirement. You know, you can experiment something if you're quick enough, if you have short cycles. Experiment, get feedback, and then try to come up with something better. And the shadowing, like I said, if you're shadowing a user for a day, of course it's very time consuming. So actually you block out a day, you couldn't do other stuff. But the pro definitely is you get inside perspective of someone, of a user. That's, I think, the biggest pro when it comes to shadowing, right? You can really pick the brain of the person and see what they're actually doing. Because I think the most important thing as a business analyst or product owner is really, do you provide value, or is your product or your requirement providing value? And the ultimate test to see if it does is it actually used? Is your product actually, or feature actually used the way you designed it? And if users don't use it, it's probably not that much worth, or has been implemented just wrongly. So observing and shadowing the user is super critical and super important for you as a business analyst.